Hey budget gardeners, Vita Loki here. Join me today as we winter sow some coneflower seeds. So let's go. It's that time of year when either we're starting to winter sow or we're starting to think about winter sowing. In today's video, I'm going to be winter sowing the coneflower seeds, but I'm also going to be answering a number of questions that many of you have been asking. But before we start, be sure to check out my winter sowing playlist that I'm going to link down below as well as up above. I've made a number of videos over the last few years having to do with the winter sowing process. I especially love using this process when it comes to sowing my perennial seeds. Perennials have been around forever. They've been dropping their seeds out in the landscape naturally and creating new plants forever. However, a woman named Trudy Davidoff came up with the whole concept of winter sowing a number of years ago. In fact, there's a Facebook community group that I absolutely love. It is full of information, and Trudy is a member of that group. What I'm going to do is put a link to that Facebook group down below. It's free to join, and it covers a lot of different topics for lots of different regions in the world. I normally like to wait until after the winter solstice to begin the winter sowing process. However, I live in an area of the world where it's very cold starting in November. You generally want to wait until your nighttime temperatures are consistently below 50 degrees Fahrenheit. And well, we're definitely in that ballpark, which is why I started winter sowing a number of weeks ago. It's so important to know your climate, the temperatures where you live, monitor them, and once you know that the conditions are right, go ahead and start the process. Perennials can be very, very expensive. I don't know about you, but I can't afford to be buying big, huge plants every year to fill all the garden spaces that I have. So that's a big reason why not only do I like to start perennials from seed, in fact, I love to collect the seeds from many perennials. The Echinacea seeds that we're going to sow today were seeds that I collected. If you've never collected your own Echinacea seeds, definitely try it this year. I'll also put a link showing how to collect the Echinacea seeds down below as well as up above. While we're winter sowing the seeds today, I'm going to be explaining why I do things the way I do them, but I'm also going to be answering some of your questions. Over the years, I've experimented with lots of different containers, not just milk jugs. I've used water jugs, juice jugs. I've even used those little lettuce containers that you get from the grocery store. And I've even used restaurant takeout containers, as well as deli meat containers. I've personally found that I like the 1 gallon jugs because I feel like I can use the handle to easily move and lift my containers around. And also I like the depth of soil that they can fill, as well as the height that's here. So when the seedlings are getting taller, they're not bumping into the top. I've removed the cover because I want snow and rain to come into the top of my container. Whatever container you use, you want to make sure that it has holes in the top so that water or rain can come in. In the past, I used to make additional holes right here, but I've found that that's not necessary as long as I have this opening in this container. In terms of the order, I like to make my drainage holes next. I feel like they are a lot easier to make before I go ahead and cut my container. Someone asked the question, have you found it makes a difference in growing seeds if the container is clear, like empty juice bottles or soda bottles, versus a 1 gallon milk or water bottle? They said that their tomato seeds did well in the gallon containers, but the ones in the clear containers didn't even grow. Everything was the same except for the containers. They were shocked that the tomatoes grew at all since they did the containers in February and set them out in February. So I'm going to talk about a few points while I'm making my drainage holes in the bottom. I have tried translucent containers, which is what this is, and I've also tried clear containers. Personally, I have found that either one works fine. I don't feel that it makes a difference, but that's just been my experience. So I'm not sure why you saw the difference between a translucent and then a clear container. But then again, if I lived in an area that was maybe very, very hot outside, then perhaps with the clear container, it lets in a lot more light than, let's say, a translucent container. So it could possibly be that the soil dried out faster in the clear container, and that's why you just had some issues there. Because when you think about it, if it's a clear container and more light is coming in, and let's say that you're not watering your container as much, or rain or snow or whatever is not coming in as much in the container, it's going to get hotter in that container. Whatever container you use, you want to make sure that you add drainage holes like this in the bottom because you want the water to drain out. The larger the surface area of your container, the more drainage holes you may need to add. I have saved a lot of my containers over time, but I've also gotten them for free from local coffee shops. So if you find that you're running out of containers, reach out to a local coffee shop. Oftentimes they'll save them for you. You just need to clean them afterwards. Whatever container you use, you want to make sure it can hold a good amount of soil, about 3 to 4 inches of soil. I'm just going to mark it here just so I know where to cut. It could even hold more soil than this. You just don't want it to be only 1 or 2 inches of soil. That soil will dry out a lot faster, and the seedlings need that soil in order to grow a little bit. I'm just using these cutting shears or tin snips. You can use scissors or whatever you have handy. I find that using something a little more heavy duty makes it easier on my hands when it comes to cutting. I won't be cutting all the way around because I want to make sure that this right here acts as a hinge and this right here is my handle. The hinge will allow me to open my container on the really hot days and then close the container on the days that are kind of cold. In regards to the tomato seeds that were sown in February and the fact that our friend was shocked that the seeds even germinated, that's the beauty of winter sowing, is that you can plant all your seeds or sow all your seeds in the coldest part of winter. It can be January or February, and it can be a seed that likes warm weather, like tomatoes. Those seeds are just going to be dormant. They're just going to sit there, and they will germinate when the time is right. So what I'm saying is you don't need to wait until the warm weather hits to sow certain seeds like tomatoes. You can do them during the coldest part of winter and it won't harm those seeds. And here's our mini greenhouse. So on those really hot days, maybe it's 70 or 80 degrees Fahrenheit, we're going to open up our containers. But then on those cold nights when a frost or a freeze is coming, we definitely want to keep our container closed. Now let's go ahead and fill up our container, and I do have a question or two regarding potting mix or soil that I'm going to cover while we fill this up. We are currently in my garage, and I have this tote here that's filled with used potting mix that came out of many of my summer container pots, window boxes, hanging baskets. The plants that were in those containers did not have any sort of disease, so I feel comfortable using this potting mix. It's still pretty wet from the summer, so I would call it a pre-moistened used potting mix. You can use brand new potting mix, but you're going to go ahead and pre-moisten it before you fill it in your container. Or you can even make your own potting mix. I have videos that show how to make potting mix. I'll link it down below as well as up above. Again, just make sure that your DIY potting mix is pre-moistened. So now I'm going to answer a question I have. I have to buy soil to fill my jugs. Should I use seed starting mix? No, I wouldn't recommend seed starting mix because it's very light, very fluffy, and it's just not a good choice for winter sowing. You need something a little bit more bulkier that can really retain the moisture and drain the moisture. Then they ask, should they use a moisture controlling potting mix? I also would not recommend that, and I've read that that's not a good choice because it will hold on to too much moisture and it can waterlog and actually rot your seedlings. So then our gardening friend said that they don't make their own, so they need to buy something, that my recommendation is appreciated. In that case, there are a couple of different things that you could do. You can buy potting mix, like there's Miracle Grow potting mix. Just make sure that it's not a potting mix that has moisture control or moisture retention inside of it. Another great option that I used to do way back when, before I started making my own, is using Pro Mix, and you can buy that in bulk at local garden centers. Some people like to use potting mix that has fertilizer in it. I don't normally like to do that, and my seedlings have been just fine. So you can see I am pressing down here lightly because I want to remove any of the air pockets that are inside of the potting mix. You can buy your own seeds or you can collect your own seeds. I love collecting my own seeds. I save a lot of money that way. So we're going to sow Echinacea. It's a dark pink color, and I got these seeds from my friend Linda. The seeds are a few years old, but they should be perfectly fine. Seeds lose their viability as time goes by. So the older the seeds, the less viable they are. But these are not that old. You can sow a few seeds and space them out, or you can sow them very heavily. It's really up to you. We're going to sow this many seeds, and you can see I still have quite a few seeds left. Echinacea is one of those plants that definitely drops its seeds and you end up with freebie plants in the yard. But I also like to sow my own seeds in a container like this because I want to have a little more control over my seedlings and the placement of them in my garden. And sometimes I also want to just pot them up, put them down in my plant nursery so other people can add them in their garden. I find that if I rely just on Mother Nature when it comes to winter sowing, then I just don't have as much control. Critters can come along and they can eat the seeds. In fact, we know birds love to eat the seeds of coneflower. And let's face it, even if the seeds drop themselves and sprout out in the landscape, what's the likelihood that I'm going to go and dig out all those seedlings that I want and move them around my yard? Sometimes it's just easier to have them germinate in this container, and then I can tackle them and move them around my yard when I have the time. So I space the seeds out a little bit. I like to do that if my seeds are larger. If my seeds are teeny tiny, then it's harder to do that, and I sprinkle them pretty heavily. Coneflower seeds need light to germinate. So what you want to do is just press the seeds into your potting mix. That way they're making good contact with the potting mix. If you are going to cover them, that's fine, but you just barely want to cover them. And you can cover them with the potting mix, or you can even take vermiculite and cover them that way. Vermiculite allows light to come in. I've never used vermiculite when it comes to winter sowing, but I know some people do like to use it. You want to add a plant label inside of your container, just in case the plant label that you add on the outside gets removed, worn off, or anything else like that. You don't need to use something fancy like this. I just have a bunch of these on hand and I'm looking to get rid of them. So what better way than using them inside my winter sown containers? You want to label it with the name of your plant. So Echinacea. I did put the color on there because I'm planning to winter sow a number of different colors of Echinacea. And I did put down the year that I collected the seeds, so it's been a few years. The reason I did that is because these are a little bit older seeds and I'm curious to see how they germinate. I like to use a garden marker. You can also use an oil-based marker or pen. You basically don't want to use something that's going to wear off in the elements, especially for the label on the outside, because what will happen is then you're not going to know what the plants are. In the past, I've used a Sharpie marker and I found that that wears off very easily. So I'm just going to put my label on the inside of my container. Some other popular labels that people have used are plastic knives that they've cut in half. Some other popular things you can use for labels are old Venetian blinds that you cut up in pieces, and I've done that before. Or used yogurt containers that you cut into strips and use those as labels. Now you're going to go ahead and water your seeds. Even though the potting mix was pre-moistened, it's a good idea to add water on the seeds just to put them in place and also just to give them that initial water that they might need. I have a small hand pump sprayer that I like to use for a lot of different garden tasks, and that includes winter sowing. When it comes to adding the water, I don't want it to be a very heavy stream because I don't want to dislodge my seeds. I'm going to do a light stream, and I'm going to add a generous amount of water. Now I'm just wiping down the sides because since I added that spray of water, it got wet out here. And when I add the tape, I want to make sure that the tape can stick without the water being there. There are a number of different ways you can close your container. I like to use duct tape, but I know some people like to use painter's tape. They find that it's easier to remove the painter's tape. Other people like to punch holes in the top as well as in the bottom and then secure the top to the bottom by placing a zip tie or a twist tie in between both the holes. And then I've seen other people cut the top all the way around and then nest the top into the bottom. But I feel that if you do that, there's a good chance that that top's going to blow away in the wind. And not only that, you then lose your handle that's in the back and you can't easily move your containers around. These are hardy perennial seeds that we just sowed. For that reason, I'm only adding a couple of pieces of tape. I used to add it all the way around for my perennials, and I found that that was a big waste of money and time. What I found is that these perennial seeds take a very long time to germinate. And when they finally do germinate, even if a frost or a freeze comes, the plants are completely fine inside of this container. When you think about it, if you have perennials out in your landscape, they drop their seeds, the seeds germinate, and if a hard frost, a hard freeze, or even some snow comes, those little seedlings will still be fine. So I feel strongly about only adding a few pieces of tape on my container and that these seedlings will still be okay. I'm making sure to press down because I want this tape to stick nicely on my container. And I'm going to add another piece of tape on this side. And it's okay if there were little openings or little gaps on the side with these hardy perennial seeds. Now, if I was winter sowing a more tender plant, like let's say a marigold or a tomato plant, in that case, I would be adding tape all the way around because I want to make sure that I'm protecting those little seedlings so when they do germinate, they are protected from the frosts and freezes that might happen. And now you want to label your container. In past years, I used to label the container itself, but I found that I can actually reuse my milk containers for a few seasons. So for that reason, I now like to just label the tape. I put the plant name on here. Some people do a numbering system. They might put number 1, and then on a piece of paper, they would say Echinacea. And then on another container, number 2, on their piece of paper, that might say tomato, and so on. So I'm just going to write Echinacea, dark pink. And I'm going to write it on the other side too. That's optional. The only reason I do that is when I have a whole bunch of milk jugs out there, it's nice to just not have to turn each milk jug around to see what's written on there. But you don't have to do this if you don't want to. You can just write it on one side. Okay, time to bring this container outside, and I have a few more questions I'm going to answer while we're out there. Wow, is it cold out here today. This is where I put my winter sown containers, and I showed you this in a previous video, but we got a lot of snow since then. So I'm going to actually get a shovel. I'm going to shovel a little area because I want to be able to place all my containers in this area for the winter. So let me get the shovel, let me clean it up, and then we'll talk. Man, is it cold out here. I think it's like 10 degrees Fahrenheit. I really should be wearing a coat. But anyway, I did shovel up an area just for all my little containers to go during the winter months, because over time, we're just going to get more and more snow. So it's important for me to have an area where I can put all my containers. But let's go ahead and go over some questions that you have. You can see I added one container over on that side there, and then I have another one that's here. But under the snow are other containers that we winter sowed together a few weeks ago. And I purposely, when I shoveled this area, I didn't take off the snow off those containers, partially because there's no need to, but partially to show you that if you have containers out in the snow like I do, they are fine. They are perfectly fine. They are just going to sit there, and then eventually these containers will thaw out from our frozen tundra that we have. The next question I have is, do you water the containers if there is no rain or any snow? The answer is, it depends. So for example, do we have any rain coming up? No. Do we have any snow coming up? Probably, but maybe not for another week. So am I going to water these containers since we have no rain and no snow coming? The answer is no. Here where I live, my daytime temperatures, if I'm lucky, are in the 30-degree Fahrenheit range. And my nighttime temperatures are generally around 0 degrees Fahrenheit to the teens degrees Fahrenheit. So basically, these milk jugs are going to be frozen from now through probably, I would say, end of February or into the March months. So if you live in a climate like I do, where you are under snow and you're going to be under snow for the next 3 months, you shouldn't have to worry about watering your containers. But if you live in an area where your containers are not frozen and they're not going to freeze, then you do need to water your containers. You might get a little bit of snow or you might get rain, and that takes care of it for you for a number of days. But then you suddenly don't have any rain or any snow. And when I say snow, I'm talking about areas where you might get like a little dusting of snow, let's say, right? So your containers are not going to freeze most likely. But in those areas where your containers are not going to freeze, then yes, you need to be monitoring those containers. So if I lived in an area like that, I would actually be coming out and picking up the containers. If they feel very light, that tells me that the containers need water. So then the next question is, I'm thinking this would only be necessary after the seeds sprout. So the answer is no. You want to make sure you continue to check your containers. And if they seem dry, you do need to add water in them. And the best thing I can think of is, let's say I scattered some teeny tiny seeds in here. And let's say those seeds that I scattered need darkness to germinate. I can't see what those seeds are doing. Maybe beneath the soil, they're just starting to sprout, but I haven't been watering those containers. What's going to happen is those seeds that are starting to sprout, they're going to die. So the best advice I can give you is, if you live in an area that is not like me, where your containers are not going to freeze, then yes, you want to be responsible. You want to be checking those containers. And if they are dry, you do need to add water. There are a lot of different ways you can add the water. If it were me, I would just use that small little spray bottle that I have, and I would spray water in the top of my containers. And the final question I have is placement. Where in the yard is best? You want to place your containers in a full sun area. You want it to be in an area where snow and rain can naturally come into your containers. You don't want to place them under any sort of eaves or a covered porch or inside of a greenhouse. And you also want to place them in an area where they're not just going to get blown over in the wind or toppled over. You need to let that rain and snow be able to come into the holes that are in the top of your container. I don't put anything around my containers in terms of corralling them, because they're not going anywhere for a long time. They're going to just actually freeze in place. But where you live, you might have to put them in a tote or inside of a milk crate or corral them all close to each other and tie something around them. But if you are going to place them in any sort of a container or a tote, that also needs to have drainage holes in them. Once the seeds start sprouting and it starts getting really hot outside, even though you're going to be opening up your containers so that the seedlings don't fry, you can also take your containers and then start moving them into a shadier location. In fact, I've even done that before. If I'm not going to get to taking the seedlings out of their container, I don't want them just being out in the hot sun, let's say in May or June. So I might take my containers and at that time move them into an area that's a little bit shadier. But to start the winter sowing process, I prefer to keep them out in the sun. I want them to get as much sun as possible, not necessarily right now, but once the snow melts, and I want those seeds to start germinating, and they're going to do it the best if they're in the sun. Okay, let's go back inside and I'm going to answer a few more questions. So now let's go over a comment that I have. Transplanting. I had great success with germination and almost all grew well in the containers, but I lost most after transplanting. Tools, transplanting into containers or directly into the ground, etc. When it comes to transplanting your seedlings, you usually want to wait until you have the first set of true leaves. The first set of leaves, those are called the cotyledon leaves. Those are the baby leaves on the plant. But the second set of leaves that are going to appear, that's the first set of what are called true leaves, regardless of the seedling and regardless of your container. Once the seedling has its first set of true leaves, that's the optimal time to go ahead and remove it from the container. There are a number of things you can do to remove the seedlings from the container. You can easily try to tease the seedlings apart, and some people like to call that the hunk of seedling method, or HOS. And that's because you're taking a chunk of seedlings, especially if you have a whole bunch of them in there, and planting them out in a grouping. But then other people like to do individual seedlings. It really depends on how many seedlings you have in your container. You don't generally need any tool to do this process. It's more of just pulling them apart out of the container. But if you had a whole bunch of seedlings jam-packed in there, you could probably use something like a hori-hori knife or a hand pruning knife and cut through to make your slices. But I've found the easiest way is just to tease apart those roots and pull apart the seedlings. And then, do you put them in a container or do you put them out in the ground? It's really up to you. I have a backyard plant nursery. I like to sell plants. So many times I like to actually up-pot or pot up my seedlings. And then each of those pots goes down to my plant nursery where I sell plants. In fact, I often pot up seedlings because I don't even know where I want to put them out in my own landscape. They might be seedlings that I grew just for myself, but I don't know where I want to put them. And I want them to put on a little more size. So for that reason, you'll see me potting them up, putting them down in my nursery, but then at a later date, shopping my nursery, getting those seedlings, and then putting them out in my landscape. But you don't need to do that step. You can definitely take the seedlings directly from the winter sown container and put them out in your landscape. And if you're going to do that, I recommend doing it on a cloudy or a rainy day. And that would be no different than any other plant that maybe you started from seed, let's say indoors, and you're putting it out in your landscape. It's a tender, fragile little plant. You don't want to put it under stress. So you want to plant those seedlings on a day that's not very hot, that's not very sunny or bright. In fact, if it's raining that day, it might even be better. And if it's not raining that day, definitely make sure that you're putting some water in the planting hole and then getting that seedling planted. If you know that it's going to be very sunny or very hot for a number of days, you could always put some sort of structure up just to add some shade to the seedling. I think that's a lot of work personally to put up shade, especially if you have a number of seedlings, but I have seen people do that. And then finally, after the seedling's in the ground, just make sure that you continue monitoring it and you don't want it to dry out. You want to keep adding water to the soil just to make sure that that seedling is hydrated. Another question that I had to do with when to fertilize the seedlings. Some people like to use potting mix in their winter sown containers that has fertilizer in it. I've never done that. Personally, I feel like that's a waste, but you can do it if you want. Generally, those seeds have everything that they need in order to grow. And even once the seeds germinate, the little seedling doesn't need a whole lot. But once they get their first set of true leaves, at that point, that's when you want to start fertilizing the seedlings. So if you have a container where it has seedlings in it with their first set of true leaves, At that point, you can start fertilizing the seedlings. In fact, I've done that before. I take a watering can, I mix in my fertilizer of choice, which if the seedlings are flowers, annuals or perennials, I'm going to use Miracle-Gro. You can use whatever you want. But if the seedlings are vegetable plants, I can use an organic fertilizer like Espoma-Gro. Or if you have seedlings that have their first set of true leaves and you're putting them out in the landscape, at that time, you can go ahead and give the seedlings fertilizer. The key is you don't want to give a full strength fertilizer to those seedlings. You don't want to overload those seedlings with too much fertilizer. So you can go ahead and dilute your fertilizer by a half. A few people asked this question, which was, which perennials, annuals, or vegetables do the best with the winter sowing process? You can never go wrong with hardy perennials. They can be native or not native, but make sure if you're going to winter sow any sort of perennial seeds, that perennial is hardy where you live. And what I mean by that is your growing zone. So any perennial that you start, it needs to be hardy down to the growing zone that you live in. So I live in zone 5B. So any perennial seeds that I'm winter sowing, they have to be able to withstand my cold winters, which for me gets down to -15 degrees Fahrenheit, and that's based on my zone 5B climate. And if you don't know what your USDA hardiness zone is, I'll put a link to it down below. You just enter in your zip code, and then it will tell you your hardiness zone. There's also a map on there that might be a little more accurate, and you can see where you're located and figure out your zone from there. I've winter sown a ton of different perennials. I don't find that there's some perennials that come up better than others. I've really had good luck in general with perennials that are hardy in my zone. Some of those perennials that I can list for you include sea holly or eryngium, balloon flower, lupin, cardinal flower, great blue lobelia, echinacea or coneflower, anise hyssop, primula or primrose, rudbeckia or black-eyed Susan, many different kinds of Shasta daisy, great blue lobelia, daylilies, baptisia or false indigo. And that's all I can think of right now. I'm sure I've tried other ones as well. But it comes down to seeds that normally you can easily collect from your own yard, which is usually the case for me, or you can buy them even on the internet. And I would say it's generally herbaceous perennials, perennials that typically die back down to the ground. But that doesn't mean you can't winter sow, let's say, a rose seed or a forsythia seed, maybe even a peony seed. There are just many seeds out there that I haven't even tried. For annuals, usually the cool flowers, and I have a video that talks more about cool flowers. I'll link it down below as well as up above. But any of those annual flowers that like cool weather, those generally do really well. Some that I can think of right off the bat include like calendula or poppies. And also any plant that you see self-sows or self-seeds itself readily in your yard. If it can drop its seeds and survive your winters and sprout for you, then that's a great candidate to winter sow. And that generally means most of the perennials that self-sow in your yard are great candidates. But even some of the annuals that I've found, for example, I've seen alyssum likes to self-sow itself very readily. That's a great annual for me to also winter sow. Or even nigella, that's another one that I've seen, it drops its seeds and then those plants come up every year. That's another great candidate. So pay attention to those flowers that you see drop their seeds and come up every single year, or they might not even be in your yard. It might be in your neighbor's yard, and they told you that there's some flower that drops its seeds, and every year the plant comes back. That's another great one to winter sow. When it comes to vegetables, I'll be honest with you, it's not something I love to do or really care to do. That doesn't mean I won't do it. It's just that I prefer to start a lot of my annual flowers and my vegetables indoors under my grow lights. But I have done it before and I've had success. Lettuce is a super easy one, and again, it loves cool weather. And you don't need to limit yourself to the cool weather plants. Some people like to do tomatoes in winter sown containers. But there are some seeds that I just will not winter sow, and those are typically the ones that take a very long time to grow from a seed to a flower, or from a seed to fruit or vegetable. And that's based on how long my growing season is. And what I mean by that is it's my average last frost date, which is May 15th, and my average first frost date, which is, I believe, generally around October 15th. That's a 5-month window for myself. So if I have a seed that I winter sow, and I'll give some examples, like impatiens or wax begonias, if I winter sow those seeds, they will most likely never bloom for me during the whole summer. So it's kind of a waste of energy and a waste of time. They just take so long to grow from seed, which is why you'll see me starting those seeds usually in like January or February. I want to make sure that I have flowers on my seedlings at the end of May when I'm putting those plants out in my landscape. But where you live, you might be able to take those same seeds of impatiens or wax begonias, winter sow them. They come up fine and they bloom for you just fine. So with those annuals as well as the vegetables, it can be a little trickier, and you really need to know how long your growing season is and how long it takes for those plants to grow and mature. Another plant that I just thought of that I would not like to winter sow would be a pepper. Pepper plants take a long time to grow from seed, and they like warmth. So for that reason, it doesn't make sense for me to winter sow a pepper seed. But I know some people have done it and successfully done it. Again, they might live in a much warmer area and their growing season might be much longer than mine. The next comment has to do with poppies. I tried winter sowing poppies in containers rather than in the ground due to space restrictions. And when I transplanted them in the spring, they didn't make it. Any tips? Thank you. They were Lauren's grape poppies. Thank you. So it sounds like your poppy seeds germinated fine. It was the process of taking them out of your container and transplanting them. That's when you lost them. And you might have lost them for a number of reasons. Yes, poppies do have a taproot and they don't like to be disturbed. But normally when you winter sow them, it's not a problem as long as you are transplanting them when they're not very big. If you're transplanting poppy seedlings with, again, just their first set of true leaves or when they're just a few inches tall, that is the best time to do it. But if you waited a little too long and your seedlings are quite large and now you're trying to transplant them, that's when they don't like having their roots disturbed. The other thing I can think of is maybe you did transplant them when they were nice and small, but you put them in soil that was dry. Or you put them in soil that was wet, but maybe it was a very sunny, a very hot day, or maybe you forgot to give them water after you transplanted them because you want to make sure that they don't dry out, that you're watering them for a number of days so that those roots can establish. There are a lot of different factors, and that's not just for poppy seedlings, that's for any winter sown seedling. You want to make sure you're doing it on days where it's not going to be too stressful on that seedling. So it's a rainy day or a cloudy day. You want to make sure that you're giving those seedlings plenty of water just so they can establish themselves. And that way you're setting them up for success. Let me know in the comment section if you've ever sown coneflower seeds before, or have you even started the winter sowing process? And if not, when do you plan on starting it? I also want to know, what is your favorite container to use when it comes to winter sowing? Drop it down in the comment section below. And until the next video, make it a great day with gardening.